I've knitted a sample of the yoke part of a top-down jumper in order to demonstrate picking up stitches for the neckline. So you can see here I've got my cast on, so that was the front sleeve, back sleeve and the second front, and then I've done increases for the front V-neck. I worked my increase make ones after the first stitch, which has given me a slightly more of a challenge in picking up than if I'd moved them 2 stitches in. So I would recommend generally when you're knitting garments you do your increases 2 stitches in from the edge. To put a neckband on this, I want to start, in this case it's a jumper, I would start by picking up from the edge of the back raglan. So I'm going to knit across the top of the left raglan sleeve, down one front, up the second side, the other side of the front, across the right raglan and across the back. And then I would continue to make my neckband in whatever stitch I'm using in the round. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate now. If, for example, you were making a cardigan, a top-down cardigan, you wouldn't be joined at this point. And for a cardigan, I would pick up the straight edge of the front of the garment, because you're going to be doing the button band and neckband all in one piece. So you pick up the straight edge from the from the finish at the bottom of the front up to the V point. You would then pick up stitches at a different rate along the V, across the right sleeve, across the back, across the left sleeve and down the left front V, and then down to the base. And you're going to be picking up at slightly different rate up a straight edge like the front band compared to a diagonal edge, which is the V shaping. But I'll talk about that as I'm doing my picking up. With the right side of the garment facing me, I initially have to pick up through the cast on stitches here. So I've got the cast on stitches of the sleeve first. I'm going to start under this cast on loop here, which is at the raglan seam point, and I'm picking up the same number of stitches as I initially cast on. So the pattern will tell you how many stitches you should be picking up in each section. So I'm picking up 1 stitch for the centre of the raglan, and then I had 3 stitches across the top of the sleeve, and then 1 stitch at the top of the front cast on. So I'm just going to get one more. So I'm going right through. So in this case I've picked up, if I just take it back again just to make the point, so as long as you're consistent you can either pick up the front loop or the back loop. So in fact I think I will pick up through the front loop of the cast on. It does depend a little bit on the method of casting on that you've used. I used the cable cast on when I cast on this garment, and I'm only picking up the front loop rather than the both loops. This one it's a little bit more difficult, so I'm going to just pick up that loop there, And now I'm going to start picking up stitches down the V-neck shaping. When you're picking up stitches from rows, because these are the ends of rows, you need more rows to the same measurement than stitches when you're working in stocking stitch. The normal ratio I would use when I'm picking up down a straight edge, for example if I was picking up just down this straight section here, I would be working so that I pick up 3 stitches for every 4 rows that I've knitted. If I picked up 1 stitch for every row, I would have far too many stitches. But when I'm picking up along a diagonal line, the number of rows are the same, but the line is longer. So I pick up at a different ratio, and I generally pick up 5 stitches for 6 rows down a diagonal line. The other thing with the V-neck is also you don't want to pick up too few stitches, because you want to avoid the top, this V point kind of pulling up in wear, because you haven't allowed enough stitches down this line. So down the diagonal line I'm going to pick up 5 stitches for every 6 rows. So my first pick up is going to be in this stitch here, and then I'm looking at the next stitch, and I'm working between the first and second stitch in the row. So this time I am going under a hole, I'm working a whole stitch in from the edge. You want to work 1 stitch in from the edge, but you want to avoid going 2 stitches in, so it does take a little bit of time to practice and a bit of care, and also good light. When you're picking up your stitches you need good light to be able to see what you're doing. So that was 1, 2, my next stitch is here, 3. I know there looks like there's a big gap at this point, but it will be fine once we finish picking up all the stitches. 4, and this is the next row down where it's a bit tight because I had an increase. 5, so that's my first 5 stitches down the V. The next row is here, but I need to miss that row, so I skip that gap and I move on to the next row down, and again it's, if I can get a clean stitch, go through this fabric from front to back, pull a new loop through. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as I say, you will find that you will probably have slightly different size gaps in alternate rows. So I need to miss the next one, and I'm going to go into, so that's missing this row, I'm going into the next row down, so that's 1. I've still not got a clean stitch, so sometimes, as I'm finding here, part of the trouble was that the back of this stitch is getting in my way, so you must, if you use your index finger of your left hand to try and roll the seam out, to try and make sure you don't catch the back of the stitch. That's 1, 2, and I'm now down to the point of the V, and this was where I'd joined from one side to the other. I'm going to pick up one more row, one more stitch there. 1, 2, 3. So you do have to kind of look at your knitting to see where you think the stitch needs to go. We don't want to come into the garment part of the knitting too much, but we don't want to have a gap at this point. So I've worked down the edge of the left front. I've done 2 repeats of picking up 5 stitches for 6 rows, and then I've got 3 stitches. I want to be able to pick up in the same sequence up the left hand side, so it's useful, you need to make a note of what you've done coming down, up the right hand side. You need to make a note of what you've done coming down the left side so that you can repeat it as a mirror on the right hand side. So if I just move my knitting around now, and I'm going to pull my needle through because it will be easier for me. Once I've finished picking up all my stitches, I will be knitting in the round, but at the minute, at this point, it's easier for me to pull the stitches onto the cord so that I can just get round this point here. So this was where we crossed over the stitches when I joined at the front V, and I'm going to go under this strand here as well as into that larger hole. Otherwise I may have a very big hole, and I don't want a very big hole because that is a stitch, but I want to take the strand of the stitch that we crossed over as well here to make sure that I'm going to try and keep as smooth a join as possible. So that's one. Then my next stitch up, or my next row up. So again, when you start coming up the second side, you've got to be careful to make sure that you're just taking the edge stitch. Don't suddenly move over into 1.5 stitches. You want to keep your line of stitches in the same position on both sides of the neckline. I've got to do one more. So there were 3 stitches together, and then I miss a row, and then I'm going to do 5 consecutive stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then again I need to miss one row here, so I'm missing that space and moving up. 1, 2, 3, this one is a little bit more difficult to get into because it was right at the top of the front. So again, sometimes you can, if you're finding it difficult to work with a knitting needle, you can use a crochet hook. So you could put a crochet hook through the fabric, put the yarn around the crochet hook, pull the loop through, and then place the loop onto your knitting needle if you find it difficult working the way I'm working. We need to pick up one more here. And now we're at the top of the front, so I'm going to pick up one stitch for the cast on stitch at the front. I'm now back to picking up stitches across the top of the sleeve, and I want to do the same on this side as I did at the beginning, so I'm going to go under the front loop of my cast on. 1, 2, 3, the top of the raglan, and then across the back. 1, 2, 3. So I just pull the stitches around. I happen to have a fairly splitting yarn, unfortunately. 5, 8. So that's picked up the stitches all the way around my neckline. So when you're getting close to the end, you should be able to stretch it all the way around your needle. My needle is a little bit long. It's a 60cm needle, but it's a little bit long for this particular neckline, which is quite small. The other point I should have mentioned right at the beginning is that I am using a needle that is 2 needle sizes smaller than I used for the body of the garment. It is usual to knit the neck bands and front bands on a needle that is smaller. You need to refer to your pattern to check what the pattern says, and also look at your needle size that you used for the main body of the garment and then work out what is 2 sizes smaller for that particular needle size. With this neckband, and with a lot of neckbands, I often work the next row to give me a garter bump. So if I was going to do this, I would actually make this whole neckband in garter stitch for this particular design I would be working. But even if you're going into rib, it's quite often a good idea to do a round of garter stitch, because sorry, I'm just going to pull the cord out at a different point, because it sits down over the pickup line and gives you a neater finish. So I'm knitting in the round. In order to knit garter stitch in the round, I'm going to have to purl my next row. The pickup row is effectively a knit row unless you have specifically picked up for a purl, which would not usually work very well, as you don't want all this stitch selvage on the right side. I want that to be on the inside, so I've used a knit pickup, but I now need to work a purl pickup. You'd place a stitch marker at the beginning and end of the round so that you know where you are. Just hold on to that end so it doesn't become too loose until you can sew it in, and then start purling. I wouldn't normally do any decreases until I've worked this round. So effectively, if I'm working a neckband in garter stitch, I would work my V-neck decreases on the knit rounds. So I really needed magic loop to do this. It's being a little awkward, but you can work by just pulling the cord through at various points, just to make it easier for you to manage the needles. But on a full-size garment you would easily get the stitches for an adult V-neck on a 60cm needle. You wouldn't have to fiddle about like I am here. So if I just lay this down, you can see that once you start knitting you get this little ridge which tends to sit down over the top of the picked up stitches and helps to neaten the look of the front band. With this particular design, so I think I've got one more stitch, which brings me down to the, one more. Oops, let me just knit this, one more stitch, which I think brings me to the point of the V. I would also, it's probably helpful when you're picking up, put a stitch marker on your needle once you'd got to the end of picking up down the first side of the front. Put a stitch marker here so that you now know you're going up the second side, because the decreases are going to be worked either side of this V point. So it's important to know where the V point of the neckline is in order to do your decreases either side of this point, so that you get a nice neat mitered V point. That should help with picking up the stitches for your neckband.